Thank you for joining us for another week of Bible reading devotionals. This week we're continuing our series before Christmas, looking at kind of the Advent season. And this week is all about hope. So all week long we'll be talking about hope. And this morning our first passage comes from Psalm 33. So why don't you check that out with me? Beginning in verse 16. No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. A horse is a vain hope for deliverance. Despite all its strength, it cannot save. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love, to deliver them from death and to keep them alive in famine. We wait and hope for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love be with us, Lord, even as we put our hope in you. Now, the psalm describes some different situations. It talks about war, it talks about famine, it talks about kind of enemies at the gates. And for us, these are kind of lost metaphors because we don't really experience those things. But for people at this time, for God's people in the nation of Israel, these were kind of common occurrences. If you read throughout the Old Testament, through all the history books, there's always some army marching against somebody. There's always a famine. There's always a siege or enemies at the gates. And so in the midst of war, the psalm says, like in the midst of war, like place your hope in God. In the midst of famine, place your hope in God. When there are enemies at the gates, place your hope in God. And that sounds great for that, but what's it mean for us? Because like I said, we don't really experience war or famine or enemies at the gates. And what's it really mean to place our hope in something other than God? Because God says, hey, place your hope in me instead of these things. Because in war, the people could have placed their hope in their own military strength. In famine, they could have placed their hope in their own preparations. And when their city's under siege, they could place their own hope in their walls or in their shields or in what they have to control, what they have to defend themselves. But God says to these people through this psalm, don't place your hope in those things, place your hope in me. And so for us who don't really have war, who don't really have famine, who don't have enemies at the gates, where do we place our hope? Because we still have difficult, trying situations. We have a pandemic. We have job loss. We have frustrations. We have discouragement. We have kids on Zoom classes and you as a parent trying to work from home. Like we have these challenges that we face. And when we face these challenges, we face the same temptation. Where am I going to place my hope? In the midst of a pandemic, are we going to place our hope in a vaccine? In the midst of financial hardship? Are we going to place our hope in money? In the midst of kind of like all this craziness at home, are we going to place our hope in the plans that we make, like our really, really good plans? The trouble is, anything on this earth in which we can place our hope, those things will eventually fail. If we place our hope in our finances, what happens if we lose a job? If we place our hope in our health, what happens if we get sick? If we place our hope in a rigid, structured system and living life the way we should, what happens when that gets blown up for 8 solid months? What happens then? This is why God invites us to place our hope in him. Because God is sovereign. He is in control of absolutely everything in this universe. And more than that, he loves you. Think about that. The all-powerful God of the universe who created everything, who is in control of everything, who holds the whole world in his hand, like the kids' song says. That God loves you. That God invites you to place your hope in him. Instead of trusting in things, instead of placing your hope in things that fail, that fade, or fall away, God says, place your hope in me. Because God knows he won't fail you. No matter what. So no matter whatever we face, whatever difficulties, whatever hardships, God says, place our hope in him. Because the promise isn't that we won't face hardships. The promise isn't that we won't face trials. The promise isn't that we won't face difficult seasons. The promise is that when we place our hope in God, he is there with us in the midst of that. Which is what we celebrate at Christmas, that God came to be with us. So, as we start this conversation about hope this week, I just invite you to think, where are you placing your hope? And if that were to fail, if that were to fall, if that were to fade away, where would you be? Where are you placing your hope? Thanks for joining us today.